You're listening to Cornerstone, West Los Angeles.
Let's read today's passage. We're in James chapter 1, verses 21 through 27. It is on page 1011 of your pew Bibles, those red guys in front of you, and also on the screen. We're going to read, what did I say, verse 21 through 27. Here it is. Therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. But be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. This is the word of the Lord. Now, we're in the middle of a series on the Imago Dei, the image of God. We're exploring what it means that every human being is made in the image of God. And what we've said is that the image of God is really about kind of two things: connection and reflection. It's about connection in a similar way that an artist sort of has a connection to his or her work. They put the piece of themselves in it, they're connected to it. You can't treat a piece of artwork a certain way without that reflecting on your view of the artist. And in the same way, every human being is connected to God. The way you treat another human being is connected to the way you think about, treat the God who made them. But then also reflection. Every human being is meant to reflect God in the way a mirror can reflect the image of a person. And so God built us to reflect him into the world. So we as humans are built to be this reflection of his goodness, his love, his glory, his holiness, his mercy in the world around us. And in this series, we've been looking at what that image of God means for how we treat others, especially in a society that is more and more divided. Sometimes it seems almost every day. So really, what we're doing is taking time to see how can we be doers of God's word and not just hearers only, like James says. James explains how central this is in Christianity. Knowing what God says, knowing the truth, is not enough. It is insufficient. We have to act on it in our lives. And so when it comes to the image of God, it's unacceptable for us to simply nod our heads and say, yes, of course I believe that. We have to somehow act it out in the way we live, the way we conduct ourselves in our world, even in this room and in our church community. And this morning, the last few mornings, we've learned about what that means we looked at, all too briefly, we looked at these things. We looked at culture and ethnicity. We looked at prenatal children last week. But James gives us his own test case this week. He gives us widows and orphans. And we're going to look specifically at orphans this morning, though I should say, feel free to swap out widow for orphan throughout the message, and you can pretty much apply the same thing. I'm as firm a believer as bringing widows and widowers into our families as I am orphans. But nevertheless, we're going to look at orphans this morning. So how do we be doers, not just hearers, when it comes to orphans in Los Angeles? Here's what we're going to learn. 3 things, believe it or not. 3 things. The reality of orphans, the value of orphans, and our responsibility to orphans. Reality, value, and responsibility. So first, we got to learn about the reality of orphans. James instructs us to care for orphans in their distress. And I have yet to meet the person who's anti-orphan. Everyone's pro-orphan. It's very hard to find the anti-orphan person. And yet, for most people, orphans just aren't a reality. They're not very close to home. And so when I talk about orphans with people, I mean, we really only have 2 categories, like kids in the third world country and Batman. Like, this is what we're working with when it comes to orphans. Orphans are far away in other parts of the world, or they're people you read about in books or see in movies. And so when we think about orphans, you either get kind of an image of an orphanage, thousands of miles away that you saw like on a TV commercial for a charity, or you get the image of this sort of 7-year-old, cute, precocious Oliver Twist or Annie kind of a thing, where they're rough around the edges, but all they really need is Daddy Warbucks to come in and straighten everything out, and they'll be fine. This kind of an idea. And yet, the Bible never portrays orphans with that kind of narrow definition. The Bible talks about orphans over 40 times, and when it does, it uses them as this chief example of people who were marginalized, who were vulnerable and had no voice. Oftentimes, you'll see the word fatherless used. That was in Psalm 146 that Matt took his prayer from. The idea was they weren't defined as kids with two dead parents. Oftentimes in the Bible, orphans have a living mother. The idea was that the father, who in that culture was the protector, was the source of sustenance and protection and basically life in a lot of ways, was out of the picture, usually by death, sometimes for other reasons. And in that way, according to the Bible, an orphan is any child that doesn't have the protection and support of a family. Because back then, if you had no father, you were prone to abuse. No one had to really care what they did to you because who was going to protect you? You were prone to neglect. Any child that doesn't have the love, support, protection of a family would be classified in the Bible as an orphan. And if that's what an orphan is, then that means that orphans are a massive reality in our city, in our backyard, maybe on your street or in your apartment complex. Like they're all around us. We miss that reality a lot because we don't call them orphans. In our society, we call them foster kids. That's our word for orphan. Because foster care is our society's, our nation's orphan care system. Kids with parents who neglect them or abuse them, kids without the protection and support of a family, the orphans, are taken by the government and put in what we call foster homes. And they either get adopted out of that, sometimes their parents turn their life around and they're reunified with their parents. Sometimes they bounce from foster home to foster home until they age out of the system. And then they're just sort of on their own in the world. Our nation's orphans, in other words, are in the foster care system. That's where the orphans are in the United States, for the most part. And like Chris said, we in Los Angeles have the largest foster care system in the nation. We have the most orphans of any other county. When you drive our streets, you yourself, you and me, we are more surrounded by orphans than anywhere else in the United States. And the reality then is that orphans are a reality. We live in a city full of orphans, and the reality for those orphans is that they're struggling. No matter what age they become orphans, their lives are very, very difficult. And sometimes it's hard to appreciate when you don't see them. They're not a reality to you. Some of them become orphans as infants. They're born with drugs in their system maybe, or a host of other issues, which means they had to struggle to survive like even inside the womb. Like they didn't get a free pass even in there. And their first event in their lives is being taken away from their mother and handed to someone enrolled in foster care. That's their first life experience. Some of them become orphans as toddlers. They're neglected, they're abused, they're not given enough food or a place to sleep, and they have to see things toddlers maybe shouldn't see. They don't really have tools to cope with some of the things that they have to see. And there's a knock on the door one day, and someone they don't know takes them away from the only home they've ever known, the only toys they've ever played with, and the only people they've ever laid eyes on. Some become orphans in elementary school. It's actually probably the most common. They go to school one day, and there's a bruise they can't hide. Or their clothes are just too ratty, and someone finally notices. Or they're so hungry they can't pay attention in class. And they get called to the office. They get called to the principal's office, which typically is a bad thing. And then when they get there, someone they don't know tells them that they're not going home, and they can't tell them if or when they'll ever see that home again. And all these kids, no matter what happens when they get placed, all these kids have the same experience from that point on. They get taken in a car they've never ridden to a neighborhood they've never been to, and knock on the door of a house they've never seen and have it opened by people they've never met. And they go to a bed they've never slept in, and they have toys that aren't theirs, and they have no idea for how long that will last until another knock on the door comes. Sometimes they get a visit from their birth parents, and then they don't go home with them. They go back to wherever they were, to the other house and the other bed. Sometimes they get moved from home to home, often without even asking them or even telling them it's coming. There's just one more knock on the door, and off they go to a new place with a new bed and new smells and new everything. In other words, the reality of orphans, especially in Los Angeles, is that they're not cute and precocious. A lot of them are scared, and they're worried. And they're trying to get some kind of security. They're trying to get some kind of stability, but they almost can't because the minute they have it, they don't know when the next knock on the door comes and all of it gets taken away and now they're somewhere new. They're struggling. And when they age out of the system without being adopted, they reach the age of 18 and now they're not in the foster care system anymore. They're just, people making it on their own in this big city. You heard the statistics. Half of them will end up homeless within 4 years. Well over half will end up being incarcerated or arrested. And the numbers for substance abuse and domestic violence and their own kids going into foster care, they're incredibly high. And all of that started when they first became orphans, typically under the age of 7. For reference, my daughter Quinn is 6. That's when it started. That's the reality of orphans in Los Angeles. There are children all over our city who are hurting, and they're defenseless. And they're on our streets, and they're in the school down the block, and they're in your grocery store almost every day. And they're full of complicated emotions and experiences and needs, and they have no voice. They're the marginalized of the marginalized. And James says true Christianity looks like caring for orphans in their distress. And we can't obey the Bible. We can't be doers of the word and not just hearers until we know their existence and we know their distress. So as Christians, it's not sort of optional to be aware of these things. This is one of those things that we have to know the reality of orphans close to home if we're going to be doers of the word, not just hearers. We can't say we believe in caring for orphans in their distress if we don't actively try and understand the reality of orphans in our own backyard, in our own grocery stores. So what's the reality? They're all around us and they're struggling. And understanding that reality is a basic part of being a Christian. It's not an extracurricular. It's in the center. So that's the reality of orphans. Now, the value of orphans. Okay, when most people see the full reality of this in Los Angeles, even if you don't, even if you just brush up against it here and there, it's just so overwhelming. It's incredibly overwhelming because what ends up happening is you begin to think of kids in the system is one of the things people tend to say, and all you can see is their brokenness and their baggage. It's hard to see anything else but that. In other words, for most people, they don't see orphans, they just see issues. Rebellious kids, kids who don't have self-control, kids with learning disabilities, kids who don't have the right social skills, kids who don't pay attention in class, kids who have emotional baggage. Some of the kids have PTSD. It's a bunch of issues. And they come often with biological parents who are kind of attached to them and kind of not, who are equally struggling. You want them back, but kind of don't, but have some self-destructive issues and habits and try sometimes but not all the time and have their own issues, and they're very easily labeled too. Well, they're just problems. And so people look at the foster care system. It's this big broken system. Our orphan care system in the nation is, that's a big broken system. Instead of seeing inside of it kids and parents with inherent value and worth as human beings. It's just so easy to do that. And that has effects. Because when you look at kids and their parents, their birth parents, as issues, as problems to be solved or problems to be avoided, well, that's going to do stuff like make LA a place that has a desperate shortage of places for kids to sleep. I know social workers who will have a kid who's abused or neglected or whatever handed to them, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, and that kid goes in their car, and then they'll make 40 phone calls trying to place that kid while they're driving around LA with this kid in the back of their car, and that kid has no idea where they're going to go that night. To the point where a lot of them end up sleeping in like the government system's office on cots in their social worker's office, basically. It's a desperate shortage, and they get picked up from elementary school with nothing but their backpacks, and there aren't enough foster parents out there, and so they sleep in a cot in an office. That's their first experience of being away from home. Why? Because for so many people, it's easy to look at these kids as issues and not kids with value. But the Bible, I would think this is clear if you've read the Bible abjectly forbids that way of thinking. That's not what we are allowed to do. Their history and their baggage and their struggles are absolutely real, I promise you. They're very, very real. But that's not the lens we see them through. The Bible would tell you and me that we see their value first and everything else second. Why? Okay, why does the Bible put that on? How does the Bible see the value of orphans? Well, there's several ways. We've said throughout the series that every human being bears the image of God. In other words, foster kids nor their parents are less valuable, less deserving of dignity and attention. They don't deserve a less space in our lives because they have a difficult background. That's not how that works. We don't give them attention either because we're just compassionate people, because compassion dries up. We don't give them attention because of pity, because pity can move around on you. We give them attention, we give them dignity, we hold them up as valuable because they're made in the image of God, and there's nothing they can do to change that. But the Bible actually gives you a lot more reasons to value orphans. First, orphans have value because they have a very special place in God's heart. God talks about orphans as that chief example of the marginalized, of the voiceless, and he's very concerned that we know he loves them. Many places to go, but Psalm 68:5, Father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. Now, when someone says, tell me about yourself, you typically don't say something like, well, I was born, got a couple hands, couple feet, I eat food. You don't go with sort of things. You say more things like that make you stand out. Things that someone has to know in order to know you well. And God here is telling us that what stands out about himself is that he loves orphans. It's one of the things that characterizes him. And it goes even deeper than that. He actually says he's the father of the fatherless. It's not just compassion, it's intervention. In that culture, if you lost a father, you lost your protector. And people couldn't neglect you. They could get away with kind of whatever they wanted because there was no one there to advocate for you, no one there to protect you. But God here says, no, don't misunderstand anything. They might not have an earthly father, but they have one in heaven. I am the father of the fatherless. In other words, you must treat them as having the highest value because the one who has stepped into the role of father in their lives is God himself. Incredible value. And that's what he tells his people in Isaiah 1. He's in the middle of, if you know anything about Isaiah, this is the part where God's people had sort of, many parts of the Bible are like this, especially in the Old Testament. They sort of turned away, they did some bad stuff, but they're still doing all the outward stuff. They're still coming to the temple, they're still doing the prayer, making the sacrifices, all the stuff. And God is telling them, he's in the middle of telling them this. Basically, I don't want you to come to worship. Don't pray. I'm not going to listen to you when you pray. I don't want you to make sacrifices. I don't want you to come to the temple. Why? He says, because you're doing all these religious things, but you're not reflecting my heart in your life. You're being hearers, not doers. All you're doing is sort of external. And he says, here's what I want you to do. This is verse 16. I want you to wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes, cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. In other words, what he's saying is care for justice, care for the orphan specifically, is not peripheral. It's central for his people. The other things we do just don't make sense if we're not doing this also. Do you see how strong this is? It put me on my heels a bit this week because he's actually saying, don't come worship me. Like, don't bother praying if you aren't actively seeking to care for those who are in need. It's a really strong statement. And in the middle of it all is the fatherless, is the orphan. That's how much value he places on orphans, and that's the value he wants us to place on orphans. Is that the value that we see when we see foster kids, or hear about foster kids, or think about the foster care system? God is basically saying to us, there are treasures in your city, in your neighborhood, in your grocery store. I'm the father to those fatherless, and I expect you, my people, to reflect that heart to them. Do you see their value? If you don't, if you don't actively see that, if you're actively turning away from that, don't bother praying. Don't worry about coming to church. It's a very strong statement. And there's even more. Orphans have value not just because God has a special place for them in his heart, but because the gospel tells us that you and me, we are exactly like them. Galatians 4, in the New Testament, Paul says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. In other words, the Bible suggests in multiple places that all of us start out as orphans. In the ultimate sense, we're runaways. We bounce from place to place looking for security on a spiritual level and sometimes on a physical level. The Bible talks about idols, these sort of things that you look to for care and support, sustenance, provision, love in general. And so you say, if I just get some money, if I just get some success, if I just get some friends, if I just get my family back together, if I just get a spouse or a romance, if I just get this, then I'll have that love, that protection, that provision, that internal sense of security where I know the floor is not going to drop out from under me. I know I'll be safe. And each one of those, the Bible says, is an idol. it's basically a bad caretaker. You think it's going to take care of you, keep you safe and secure, but it actually does it. It actually ends up abusing you. It uses you up because you never get fatherly love from the God of money. It's never going to work. You'll always have to keep proving yourself. You always have to be in top form. You always have to worry that you won't have a safe place to call home if your bank account begins to dip. You never get fatherly love from the God of attractiveness or the God of family. You never get these sorts of things. They're bad caretakers. They don't adopt you. They leave you as orphans. And they use you while you're there. And it all happened because we ran. You're in that position, and I'm in that position because we ran. When God asserted himself in my life and in your life, we kicked and we screamed and we said, no, on my terms. I'm in control of my life. I will make my own home. I don't need you for this. We ran. And we did it in spite and left. We don't need his love, we don't need his comfort, but we end up bouncing around, don't we, from place to place, from thing to thing, from idol to idol, from one bad caretaker to the next. He had every right to ignore me. Every right. He had every right to just walk away. But he didn't. It says in Galatians, he sent Jesus when the fullness of time had come, to die in my place. All the shame, all the guilt, he takes it on himself, and in that way opens the door to God's own home, to God's own household. And for anyone who turns around, no matter what you've done, no matter what you've become, no matter where you've gone, what you've been through, he's determined to be your father. He's the God of adoption. He's the God of taking in orphans. Like me. And when that happens, it's beautiful. He sends his own Holy Spirit to testify not just the formal Father, but Abba Father, Dad. There is a way, whatever your situation growing up, whatever your original family was like, all of us in the room, our whole lives, we've just been looking for a dad. The ultimate dad. That gives you the protection and the love and the adoption and takes away the worry that the floor will ever drop out from under you, that there will ever come a knock on the door that says, you're leaving now. And in Jesus, because of his gospel, we have a dad. We're adopted. And because of that, we're heirs. We don't have time to go into all of that. When I adopted Olivia, we went to court, in the courtroom, and there's this crazy ceremony. I mean, it's oddly traditional and old. And, you have to you're raising your hand and you're saying, she is now to be treated as one of your own natural children, and so on and so forth, with all the rights due that natural child, so on and so forth. I mean, basically, she is now one of my natural children. There's really no distinction in the law's eyes and in reality's eyes between the kids that were mine biologically and the one that's been adopted. Heir. That's the kind of adoption we've received. Heir. Not only do you have a home and a dad, but it's a dad who's your real dad. It's not just playing around. It's not just semantics. You're his. And when you see that, once you truly understand the gospel, don't you see? Can you look at an orphan and not see yourself? Should you ever be able to look at a foster kid and not go, oh, that's me? You don't need them to look like Annie or Oliver Twist. You don't need them to be cute or precocious. In fact, the more they struggle, the more you can identify with them. And there is nothing in that moment when you grasp these sorts of things that will stop you, that can keep you from showing that kind of gospel love to them. You can't prevent yourself. The reason we care for orphans as Christians, the reason we sacrifice for them, the reason we look at them as having value and hope and a future, is not because of how sad their situation makes us. It's not because of how much compassion we have. It's definitely not because we want to be people who make a difference in the world. No, the reason we care is because the gospel drives us to it. You can't help but care when you realize, ultimately, we're all them. How do you not turn around and show that to the ones who are in our grocery stores in our backyard? Our city is full of children that God says they're incredibly valuable, he says. There are children that he demands receive justice and care. He's very concerned. And almost everyone around tends to ignore their existence, or at least kind of think of them as just a little too broken to do much more than maybe give some money to or say a prayer for. But not us. Not us. When other people look at Los Angeles orphans as kids with issues, we Christians look at them as kids with value. When other people look at orphans, look at foster kids, as people they can't afford to help, we look at them as people that we can't afford to neglect. When others look at them and see someone who's incredibly different, we look at them and see someone who is incredibly similar to you and me. When others look at them and see someone who will be a drain on their life, we look at foster kids and see someone who will drive us deeper into the gospel that we love. They have incredible value. And, number 3, it's our responsibility to demonstrate that. Our responsibility to orphans. James says that true religion is caring for orphans and widows in their distress. That means it is not optional for us to deal with the orphan crisis in our city. It's not sort of a, well, if we get around to it. You know, we do have a lot of things to do on Sunday mornings, and we got to sing some songs. We have a lot of things we got to do, and if we can get around to it, then we'll take care of that orphan crisis as well. Chip away at it. That's not how this works. If this is part of the heart, if this is part and parcel of true religion, of pure undefiled religion, then it's a responsibility, not an option. We have a responsibility to the orphans in our city, given to us not by our own particular proclivities, but by God Himself. Now, that means that we're not supposed to be helping here and there as we can. We should be known as Christians as the people who are out in front of this, leading the rest of our city in this kind of care. Not just for orphans, for all the marginalized, but especially for the chief example of the marginalized in the Bible, which is the orphan. The voiceless of the voiceless. Now, that's kind of simple. Okay, yes, good, we should all do it. What does that look like? Like, what in the world does that mean in West LA? This is incredibly complicated. It's a very complicated system. The whole thing is a little crazy. What do we actually do then? How do we discharge our responsibility to orphans here in Los Angeles? It's easy to be overwhelmed at the number and the difficulty when it comes to foster care and orphans in LA. Most of us, I would say, feel like our lives are pretty full now. You already feel like I need to sort of pare down the things going on in my life. Everyone in LA is busy. We're always busy. So if we're already too busy, it's natural to think, well, there's no way I can take a child in. There's no way I can really do much about this. I'm already too busy as it is. And for some people, that's true. For some people, in a sense, your life might be too full, or it might be wise to not take a child in. But not all of us. Look, one of the best things about this church, this is going to sound weird, one of the best things about this church is I am very comfortable with what's going to happen, give or take, as comfortable as one gets, if my wife and I just sort of died suddenly. It's a weird thing to be comfortable with, and not super comfortable with it, but if it were to happen, I got 4 kids, and they're cute, but they're loud, and I love them with all of my heart, and if we were to go, I know exactly what, and if they had nowhere to go, I know exactly what this church does. You figure it out. I know you would. Because I do it for you. I know if any of you, I know pretty much everyone here in the room almost, the people here with kids, if you died all of a sudden, I know exactly what I would do. I know what we'd all do. We'd figure it out, tighten our belts, change our living situation. I don't know, but they're not going anywhere. We'd make it happen. Why? Well, I'd like to think that we do that not because we play favorites with kids. It's not, oh, well, these kids are more valuable than other kids. That's not why we do it. We do it because these kids in our church, they're real. We see the image of God in them. We know they need love. And when they're in need, we're going to go, look, I don't know, but we'll figure it out. Well, there are kids in this city right now who are just as real, just as much of the Imago Dei. My point is this. If you would want to think about rearranging your life for one of my kids, why would we not think about rearranging our lives for one of the other ones? One who's in our neighborhood, in our backyard. We should all be asking, do we have more room than we realize? Simply because these are real kids in a real city, the reality of orphans, the value of orphans. We should be asking, should we be rearranging our lives around kids in need, even if we don't know them yet? Not just wait for the ones we do know to be in need? They're important questions. And yet, look, that being said, for some people, taking a child in is just not a possibility or not wise. I'm pretty sure they don't certify you for foster care if you live in the dorms in college. I just don't think that would work. You know, like and there's lots of other situations. You know, maybe you don't have any space in your apartment or no ability to move. You live in a studio with 4 people. They're probably not going to certify that. You know, maybe you're raising kids and you're taking care of your aging parents at the same time. There's all sorts of reasons why you just couldn't. No matter how much you wanted to, you wouldn't be able to. It just would be so unwise to take in a child. But the truth is that no matter what your situation, everyone is called to orphan care because everyone is called to true religion. Everyone is called to pure and undefiled religion. So there's no exceptions to caring for orphans. James wouldn't tell us it's pure and undefiled religion if only some of us could be a part of it. And one of the best ways I've understood this is a guy named Jason Johnson. He talks about this idea with a river. He says, everyone's called to orphan care, but it's usually in very different ways. Just like the body of Christ, he says. Everyone is called to something different. And he says, okay, imagine that you were a bunch of us, all of us in the room, we're on a big camping trip. I don't like camping, but we'll go with it. So we're on a big camping trip, and I haven't left for the hotel yet. And so we're all there, and there's this big rushing river. You know, it's going by, and its current's really strong, really big, and it terminates in this waterfall. Half a mile that way. And so we're hanging out, we're sort of setting up camp, looking around, and all of a sudden we see kids going by, toddlers, elementary school kids, like rushing by in the river. He says, well, what would we do? He says, well, some people would run over there and pull them out. I mean, you just start pulling them out. You make change. You're just trying to get them. I mean, you get them out of. They're going to a waterfall. You're getting them out of the river as fast as you can. Other people are grabbing those kids and making them warm. Some people are probably cooking food for the people who, after a few hours, are getting tired of pulling kids out of the river and need breaks, moving back and forth. He says, but then some people are going to run down towards the waterfall to try and get some kids that have already passed. And he's like, I hope some people will go upriver and figure out why are these kids getting thrown in the river in the first place? Let's see if we can stop that. In the same way, the orphan care is like that river. There are kids in all different parts of it. And there are ways to contribute to their care in all different ways along that river and even in one particular spot. No one will do everything, but everyone must do something. And some of us, you can go upriver. We have people in this church who've adopted domestically, who are in the process of adopting internationally. You're basically getting kids before they get dropped in the river. Before kids get into the river, you connect with them in these deep ways. Others go upriver to advocate for new policies, for new family-friendly policies, to support women in crisis pregnancies like Clarice, we talked about last week, to create programs and opportunities to keep families out of poverty, one of the biggest reasons why kids end up in the foster system, or to help struggling parents learn to care for their kids. That's all orphan care. You're just going upriver, trying to get them out of going in the first place. Some of us go downriver towards the waterfall. You're caring for orphans who've aged out, who might be homeless or incarcerated or struggling. You're helping train them. You're helping mentor them as 18, 19, 20-year-olds. You're being a part of helping and caring for orphans in their distress. Some of us will go downriver and mentor kids, older kids, or just kids who are aging out, or just kids in the middle, who are in the system and you don't have room to actually take them into your house. Maybe you're the champion for Royal Family Kids. Maybe you're the one in this service, in this church, who says, yeah, I want to give my time to that. And all of a sudden, we have 10, 20, maybe more camps where hundreds of foster kids are connected with mentors that stick with them for the rest of their lives in foster care. There are people in this church who've gone to Royal and have come back, and they still, 4, 5, 6 years later, know the exact circumstances of the foster kid that they were placed with, that they began to mentor. They love them, they pray for them, they talk to them, they visit them. Maybe you could be a part of that. It's all orphan care. Some of us, though, will grab kids out of the river as you go by. You'll be foster parents. You'll learn, you'll get certified, it's a lot of training. Maybe you'll take kids in so they have a loving place to stay while their birth parents get their lives back on their feet, for 6 months or a year, maybe 2. Maybe you'll take kids in so you might adopt them. That's what my wife and I ended up doing. Maybe you'll do respite care. That's this kind of thing where you get trained and you take kids for 2 weeks. When foster parents have a family emergency or something, and they're like, what are we going to do? We have this kid, you can't take them out of state lines maybe, or how are we going to handle this? And we don't want to give them back into the system. We love them to death, and you can be the person that says, give them to me for 2 weeks, I got it. Maybe you can do that kind of respite care. And many of us will support those people who are bringing kids into their home, and support those people who are working on policies, and support those people who are mentoring foster kids. You can support financially. Private adoption is very expensive. And there are places with grants, and we do our best to help out as a church. But even foster care can bring on unanticipated expenses. You can support spiritually. Look, it is not to be overlooked, the power of fervent, consistent prayer. It's like a real thing. I've experienced it in my own life in the system. You can support physically. Look, offer babysitting. There's a million trainings. There's a million different caseworker visits. Say, hey, I got some free time. I can't take a kid because I'm in the dorms, but what I can do is come to your house and I can watch your kids for like a couple hours while you have 8 caseworkers coming and looking at different things and testing fire alarms. Like, I can do that. Bringing meals, bringing groceries, just coming by to hang out or help when things get crazy, because they get crazy. You can support emotionally. One of the hardest things I've found when I talk to foster parents, people who are pulling kids out of the river right there, is that they feel like no one really understands their experience. They're surrounded by people who are sort of generically supportive, but no one who really knows what it's like or how it feels. Well, you can learn about that experience. You can find ways to be compassionate. You can give them someone to talk to. We have a foster care support group you can attend just to learn what it's like. Now, there's a lot of ways to help then. Do you see? Everyone must do something. Everyone is called to orphan care. So a big question is, what is your something? But let me talk for a moment to those of you who right now are really torn. Because you're thinking to yourself, like I thought to myself, like I think almost everyone who does this thinks to themselves, I really want to do this, but I'm really scared of doing this. I don't know how to make this a reality. I don't know if I can handle it. What if I fall in love day 2 and they get taken back to reunified with their birth family at day 512? What if I take them in and I end up adopting them, and then all of a sudden I find out that they have some handicap or disability or something's going on that I don't know how to handle, and I don't know if I have the capacity for that. Look, yes, all realities. Those are all legitimate things that have happened and do happen and will continue to happen. The truth is, you bond quickly with these kids, and there's no guarantee that you will ever see them again. There could become a day where you never see them again, and they never remember you. That's true. There are usually birth parents involved. That means visitation. That comes with a lot of fear and worry and a total lack of control of your future. It's absolutely true. You have no idea what they will turn out to be in the short term or the long term. Yes. They will dominate your life and your heart and your home in a way that you cannot control. Yes. There is a reason why a lot of people let someone else do this. But let me tell you this. If you choose to take in a child, your church family first will be right there with you. At Cornerstone, some of us are going to be bringing kids into our home. The rest of us are going to find ways to serve and support them. If you take a child in, you will never be alone here. We will rally. We'll be all around. And if you're a part of this church family, your job is to rally, to be all around. They should never be alone because of you. There'll be meals and there'll be prayers, there'll be support groups and more. If you want to learn more, we have a support group this coming Saturday, February 4th, 10 to noon. Just come listen to what the support looks like. Come listen to what the experience is like. We have private adoption, foster care, we've got CASA advocates, all sorts of stuff. Come hang out with us. Email me. I'll let you know. There are bagels. You just come if you want to learn more. If the bagels got you there, that's great. But it's not just that your church family will be around you and support you. Look, the Bible's really clear, and if you're a Christian, you've experienced it, and I have too. God empowers us to do what he calls us to do. Part of that's through your church community. Part of that's through sort of his hands and feet in the people around you. But there's more. Look, he meets you when you're in need. He gives you faith when you lack it. You can trust him to support you when you don't know what comes next and you don't know how this is going to work. As James 1:25, the one who looks into the law and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. Blessed doesn't mean everything turns out rosy. Blessed means even when things aren't rosy, God never leaves. He's right there with you with his comfort and that peace that transcends understanding. Look, in the midst of it all, you will know him better. I remember when Liv was 6 months old, and we weren't sure if she was going to stay, and we were cool with that because we weren't in it to just adopt a kid. We were here to help. We're here to help. But then it was like, oh no, she's probably going to leave. They're probably going to take her, and she's going to go with another part of her family. That was a toughie. I remember sitting on my couch with my wife Chrissy, and we prayed. And That happens from time to time, Pastor. I should say Christian. But I remember praying, and we had what I could sort of look back to as our little Abraham and Isaac moment. There was this sense, if you know the Bible, there's a story about Abraham being called to sacrifice his child, essentially, and God stopping it at the last minute. But the idea was, look, what are you in this for, and who do you really want to know out of this? And I remember sort of spiritually, if you will, putting that 6-month-old on the altar. And I remember at that moment, feeling like, as a pastor and as a Christian, feeling like, oh, this is faith. It's no longer theoretical. The love that I'm supposed to show, the love that I've received that is supposed to be this sort of, it's all sacrificial. It's all giving and no receiving. I was finally in this position where that's actually what my concrete life was like. There was nothing I was getting out of this. There was no upside for me. There was no like, oh yeah, well, because I did this, then I can feel this way about myself. No, none of that was true. None of that happened. There was no like feeling good. It was simply, this is love. This is what it was. And in that moment, I was like, oh, yeah, this is faith. And it was weird to me to think of how little of my life had that experience. Don't think for a moment you won't be blessed in your doing. It's not outcome-based. It's relationship with God-based. If you're torn and you wonder if you can take it, you can't, but he can. If you're wondering if you can make it, you can't, but he can. I encourage you to explore. And while that's all happening, while you're learning about the gospel and you're in the middle of it and you're like, Brian, you said it was going to be hard, but I had no idea it was going to be this hard. When all that's happening, we'll be there to help you. And we're there to learn from you. We've got you if you want to do this. So, no one will do everything, but everyone has to do something. Because what we're here about, what we're here for is true religion. The gospel drives us to care for these orphans. What is your something going to be? You know, in Mark 9, Jesus he takes his child and he puts it in the midst of the disciples and he says, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. Which is funny because the disciples were just arguing about who was the most significant, like who stood out the most, who was the greatest, who's the most noticeable. And Jesus takes this child, not as an example of cuteness, but as an example of helplessness, of like total insignificance. And he says, this is how you serve me, disciples. Not because of how great you are, how influential you are, how awesome you are, how great you are at following me. No. You be helpless and insignificant, and then you love the helpless and insignificant. That's how you love me. There are deep spiritual lessons there, and there are deep practical lessons. We're the orphan who found a father, and we're now the body of Christ on the earth. A little bit later in Mark, the disciples are preventing children from coming to Jesus. It says they rebuked them. In other words, Jesus doesn't have time for you. You've got to go away. He's doing bigger things. And Jesus says, no, let the children come to me. Don't hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God. If we're the body of Christ, if that's what we're called now, then we're the place that we should be saying, bring us the children. Let us care for them, for to such belong the kingdom of God. It's not a distant problem that we should care about but not do much else. It's in our home, it's in our neighborhoods, and we are the people God provided to help. And can you imagine what would happen if we do? I tell you what, things are happening. People are talking about this more. Christians are talking about this more. We can make a dent, maybe more than a dent. There might be whole swaths of kids that because of the gospel now have whole different lives because of us. Not because of us, because of him. Can you imagine what would happen if all of a sudden everyone in Los Angeles looks around at the churches, at us, at the other churches around here that know the gospel and say, oh, geez, I hate what they believe. I hate almost all their opinions, but they better not leave our city because what would happen to all the orphans? That can be us. That should be us. Let's make it us. Let's pray.
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.